What is up, True Crime World? You're here with Luminol on the Wall. I'm Becky. Today's case takes us all the way to Las Vegas, Sin City, if you will. Now, I don't know about you, but when I talk about Vegas, it's like, Vegas! We're going to Vegas! And what happens on the Strip stays on the Strip. But today we are heading to the suburbs, and we're going to chat about the classic marriage gone wrong. But before we get into those dirty details, I have to say that my one and only trip to Las Vegas was very enlightening for me. So here's the scenario. Mother Christofferson takes 25-year-old Becky to Las Vegas. And when we check into our hotel, we get a lovely little upgrade. And when we walk through the doors into our room, we see there's one king bed. And this is a non-issue for us. We did not mind sharing a bed. However, the next morning, my mom sure as shit had a problem with it. And the reason why, as I was so kindly informed, is that I am a very invasive cuddler in my sleep. And apparently that was problematic for my mom. And I honestly thought my mom was being very dramatic. Every night from that point on, she stacked all the extra pillows in between us and would wake me up if I got too close. And the whole time I really thought my mom was kind of just being mean to me. And like I said, dramatic. However, I realized it was a problem when I was near Montreal and I had to share a bed with my brother's now ex-girlfriend. And the following morning, she was not very happy with me because all night I cuddle bombed the shit out of her. And it was like in that moment I realized, my mom was right. And now I'm just really upfront about my problem, and I let everyone know if you are going to share this bed with me, you're most likely going to get cuddles, and there's not much I can even do about it. So sleep at your own risk. So needless to say, Vegas was very enlightening. I have a cuddling problem, and if my mom hadn't been with me in Vegas, I probably would have left with a gambling problem as well, because that shit is fun. So anyways, thanks for listening to my little story, and let's get into it. So our case is about a woman named Shauna Ann Castleton. She was born on March 13th in Salt Lake City, Utah. Her parents were William and Nancy Castleton, and she had a sister named Paula and 5 brothers. And they were all raised within the Mormon Church. But in 1978, the whole family moved to Pennsylvania. They lived there a couple years, and then they relocated to North Virginia. And that is where Shauna attended middle school and high school. Now, those are some pretty tough years to be moved around and, make new friends, but Shauna adapted really well. She made new friends everywhere she went, and this was probably because of her bubbly personality and her outgoing nature. Shauna was known to be open-minded, thoughtful, and optimistic to the core. Now, by the time Shauna turned 28, she decided she wanted a new scene, so she made the bold decision to move to Las Vegas in 1994. When she got there, she landed a job at the cosmetic department in Saks Fifth Avenue in Neiman Marcus. This was a luxury department store, but after a couple years of living in Vegas, this job just didn't seem like the right fit for her. She ended up getting a job at the Fiesta Casino and Hotel as a cocktail waitress. And then in 2001, she got a job at the Palms Hotel and Casino when it first opened. And she worked there for the next 11 years. Her coworkers at the Palms only had good things to say about her. They said she was the most positive person they had ever met, and in the 11 years, they couldn't remember a single time when she wasn't smiling. While working there, she was very successful in her career as a cocktail waitress. Some of that success came from her awesome personality, but she was also very driven and dedicated to every job she had. And because of this, in the early 2000s, Shauna was making over $100,000 a year. She was obviously very good at what she did. All of her customers loved her, and there was never a single complaint about her. Now, one of her patrons ended up falling head over heels for her. His name was George Tiafe. When Shauna met George, she'd only been working at the Palms for about a year, and George was sexy. He was a firefighter in Las Vegas, and he was even on one of those fireman calendars. But his sexiness isn't what drew Shauna to him. He was also smart and caring. He had graduated from high school as a class valedictorian and homecoming king, and after that he attended West Point Military Academy. He then served in the Army Corps of Engineers, which is the military engineering branch of the U.S. Army. And while serving, he helped build schools and water systems in third world countries. While overseas, he would send money back to his mom to help look after his disabled sister. And then once he was done serving in the military, he returned back to Las Vegas and got a job as a fireman working for the city. Now you can see how great of a catch George was. He was hardworking with what seemed to be good morals, and he was charming on top of that. Who wouldn't be attracted to that? Now, Shauna and George fell in love fast, and only after a year of dating, they welcomed a baby girl. George and Shauna were both ecstatic with their new arrival. Shauna had always wanted to be a mother, and ultimately this was the best and most important accomplishment of her life. And she was very fulfilled. Everyone spoke about how natural motherhood came to her, which is such a blessing because, as we've heard several times on many podcasts, there are a lot of mothers who it does not come naturally for, and in fact, they are terrible mothers. But, as a side note, you know who is a great mother? Bevy. She's so loving and caring, and watching my sister be this amazing mother, I can imagine Shauna was just like Bevy. So overall, Shauna and George seemed like they had the perfect life, and they were both just so in love with each other and their tiny little family. Everyone also saw how George doted on Shauna and his daughter. And a couple years later, in March of 2006, they decided to get married in Hawaii with all their friends and family around them. Now, this wedded bliss didn't last all that long. By 2008, Shauna and George were having major problems in their marriage. And the catalyst for this was the big recession and housing crisis of 2008. You know, a lot of people were hit really hard and financially ruined. So because of this recession, George lost a ton of money. Now, this financial stress puts like a huge strain on their marriage. And George became a bitter, angry, and jealous man. He seemed to criticize everything Shauna did and said, and he became quite unbearable. And he was no longer the George that Shauna fell in love with. He started to become verbally abusive towards her, and in one instance, while Shauna was getting ready to go to work as a cocktail waitress, when George called her a slut in front of her daughter. And the fact that he thought that that was acceptable to do is so effed up. Now, what's really interesting, and this probably played into George's insecurities, was that Shauna made more money than George. And instead of being appreciative, he started becoming very controlling over the family finances. He would micromanage Shauna's spending, and this obviously started to become a real big issue. And over the next couple years, it only seemed to get worse. Now, even though George was pretty horrible to his wife, he somehow seemed to have a soft spot for people down on their luck. He seemed to enjoy helping people who were going through tough times and like to give them opportunities that they may not have had otherwise. At one point, George had befriended a neighbor's brother who had recently been released from prison, and he hired this man to do odd jobs around the TFA's home. Now, most people think this is pretty admirable, but Shauna immediately got a weird feeling about this guy, and he really creeped her out. She told her friends and family that she was highly uncomfortable when he was around, especially when it was just her and her daughter at home. Now, Shauna definitely voiced her concerns to George, but instead of taking his wife's concerns seriously, he just brushed her off and continued to use this man as help around the house. Now, as we know, their relationship was already on shaky grounds, and this added additional tension to their marriage. And after dealing with this volatility for years, Shauna came to the conclusion that things were most likely not going to improve. And that was not what she wanted. She had taken her marriage really seriously and tried everything, but nothing seemed to make it better. So in April of 2012, she decided to move out. She got her own townhome in the Summerlin community of Las Vegas. And at that point, Shauna and George agreed to share custody of their daughter, who was now 8. Despite separating, Shauna was pretty optimistic that they could pull through this rough patch. So they began attending marriage counseling, but unfortunately, The last little bit of hope that Shauna was holding on to was no more. By that summer, it was pretty evident that they were not going to work, and divorce was the next step. Now, being the amazing mom that Shauna was, her top priority was her daughter, and she did everything she could to make this adjustment as easy on her as possible. And even though this was really tough on Shauna, everyone in her life thought she navigated it quite gracefully. And overall, things were going well for Shauna. But one night in early September, after a long shift at the casino, Shauna came home to find that her house had been broken into. Not much was taken, but notably her engagement ring and a pair of her swimsuit bottoms were missing. What was really odd about this situation is that a pair of men's boxers size small were left behind in Shauna's home. Now, it's not every day that a criminal leaves something like that behind, right? So it seemed rather intentional and creepy. Even though this was concerning and a big invasion of her personal property and privacy, Shauna made the decision not to take any other security measures. If I was in her shoes, I personally would probably get a security system. But on the flip side, she probably thought this was an isolated event and it wouldn't happen again. So let's jump forward 3 weeks to the morning of September 29th. Now, George had just come off a 24-hour shift at the fire station. He made his way to his mom's house to pick up his daughter. From there, George and his daughter went to Shauna's home to pick something up. This was around 9 a.m. When they arrived, George and his daughter saw that the garage door was open. Now, this was unusual, but as someone with a garage, I have accidentally left my garage door open through the whole night. You think you hit the button and you actually didn't, or something is just under by the sensor and stops it from shutting. So there are several reasons why a garage door may have been left open. So they really didn't think too much of it, and they decide to enter through the garage door. And as they walked into the home, they noticed Shauna lying on the living room floor covered in blood. George immediately grabbed his daughter and they went outside. That's when he called 911. He told the dispatcher that he needed to report a break-in and a murder. He said his wife was on the floor, bloody, stiff, and not moving. George told the dispatcher that he had his daughter with him and he wanted to take her to her grandma's house. Now, the dispatch told him to stay there until police arrive. She then asked if George had seen anything suspicious, and he said no. He explained that they weren't inside long enough to notice anything or even check for a pulse. When first responders first got to the scene, they initially thought that Shauna had been shot in the head because her injuries were so bad and there was so much blood everywhere. However, they eventually determined that she had been beaten severely in the head. In time, they were able to tell that it was at least 17 times. In addition to the injuries on her head, her fingers on her right hand were also broken. They determined these to be defensive wounds. Now, neighbors told the investigators that they had heard thumping coming from Shauna's home around 3:34 a.m. that morning. But they didn't think anything of it because they knew Shauna would often arrive home from work around that time and just, assume she was kind of awake and doing something in the home, right? Now, initially, investigators looked to George as their first suspect. They were in the middle of a divorce. He was the first on the scene, and statistically, he's at the top of their list. But, as we know, George was accounted for in his 24-hour work shift at the fire station. So they initially were able to rule him out. The investigators started to think, since Shauna's home had been broken into 3 weeks prior, did she maybe have a stalker? Did someone follow her home from the casino? With the amount of people that she came into contact with on a regular basis in this industry, it's totally possible, and it happens more than you would think. But that also means that their suspect pool just got huge. So the news of Shauna's tragic death spread fairly quickly amongst her family. And what's kind of crazy is while George was still at the crime scene, Paula, Shauna's sister, called George to get more details about what had happened to her sister. And you know what? Paula recorded that conversation. She asked George what had happened, and all he could tell her is that she was lying there covered in blood. In the call, George did seem fairly upset, and he actually ended up handing the phone over to a grief counselor that had arrived on the scene. While speaking with the counselor, Paula made it very clear that she suspected George of this crime. And this was because all the conversations that she had previously had with her sister, she knew how volatile George was. But the problem was Paula just could not figure out how George did it, because he was at work. So after this conversation, Paula and her husband took the earliest flight from Nashville to Las Vegas. So the police were pretty unsure as to what direction to go in because they didn't really have much of anything. But fortunately for them, they received a phone call the following day from a man named William Panex, aka Big Will. And what he tells police breaks this case wide open. Now, first of all, who is Big Will? Well, he was a maintenance man in Las Vegas who mentored convicts who had been released from prison, and he helped them integrate them back into society and help them straighten out their lives. Now, Big Will tells the police that he received a phone call from one of the men he had mentored. His name was Greyhound. And Greyhound had called him on the 29th and said he really needed to meet up to talk. So Big Will agreed to meet up with him. And when they met up, Greyhound tells Big Will that he had just killed a woman and beat her to death with a hammer. Big Will said what really bothered him, on top of the crime, was how proud and giddy Greyhound seemed. At first, Big Will thought maybe Greyhound was just pulling his chain. But the following morning, when he learned on the news that a woman had been beaten to death in her home, he knew he needed to reach out to the police and tell them what he knew, just in case they were connected. He said he really couldn't have lived with himself if he had said nothing. So Big Will told the police that Greyhound's name was Noel Stevens, and that after being released from prison, he had lived with his sister for a short time. And after he left his sister's, he became homeless and was residing in a tent on the outskirts of Las Vegas, kind of in the desert. He was known to steal food from a grocery store called Albertsons that was more inner city, and he would also sell drugs at a Chevron gas station across the street from the grocery store. Big Will offered to take the police to this little shopping area to see if they could find Greyhound. Now, truly, they thought this was a shot in the dark. Like, what are the chances they're going to see him? But to their surprise, when they pulled up, they saw him outside of the Chevron gas station selling drugs. And because that's obviously illegal, they were able to bring him into the station. Now, what police find interesting about Noel's history was that he had never really committed a violent crime before. He had been in and out of jail for petty things and drugs. So they were wondering, how did he escalate to murder? It seemed like a pretty big leap. And also, Noel had no obvious connection to Shauna, so what would be his reasoning for killing her specifically? When Noel was first questioned about the murder, he denied everything. So police only had what Big Will had told them to go off of. So they decided to go out to the Las Vegas desert. They searched on foot and by helicopter, and they eventually find Noel's tent. There, they found a pair of rolled-up jeans covered in what looked to be blood. At the scene, they were able to confirm it was human blood by that little on-site testing kit they have, and it was confirmed it was human blood. And later, it was confirmed to be Shauna's blood. They also found a price tag with a barcode on it, and when they looked into it, they learned the barcode was associated with a specific brand of hammer. But no hammer was found in Noel's tent. After finding all this, investigators felt fairly confident that Noel was their guy. So they confronted him with what they had found at his little campsite. They also fibbed a tiny bit and told him someone had actually come forward and named him as Shauna's killer. After hearing this, Noel confessed to killing Shauna. He explained in detail what he had done to her. But He didn't give them a reason why. So investigators were still left scratching their head. How was he connected to Shauna? In hopes of finding more information, police go through Noel's phone. And my God, what they saw was crazy. It was George TFA's phone number in his call log. And not just like once. It was over and over and over again. It turns out Noel was the homeless man that George had hired to work at the family home, and was the same homeless man that made Shauna feel very uncomfortable. When Noel was asked how he knew George, he said, "That's my friend, the firefighter." The fact that they had been in contact wasn't too crazy because Noel was working for George, but when they actually received the cell phone data, they realized that George and Noel had called each other 87 times in the month leading up to Shauna's death. And there were 5 calls the night before. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't have that much maintenance going on in my home at one time to warrant that amount of calls. So that looks real suspicious. Now, remember the hammer barcode they found? Well, police looked into it and learned what type of hammer it was and that it was bought at a nearby hardware store. So they go check out the security footage from the weeks leading up to September 29th. And there were hours of footage to go through. But eventually, they saw George and Noel shopping together. They bought a hammer, a ski mask, and all black clothing. In this footage, their faces were clear as day. And once again, detectives confronted Noel with this newfound information. And Noel crumbled. And he confessed that George had paid him $600 to kill his wife. George also promised Noel that he would get thousands more after he claimed the life insurance policy. In that conversation, Noel also admitted that him and George had discussed multiple different ways to go about this, and ultimately agreed that a home invasion scenario was the best way to do it. This also included the robbery 3 weeks before she died. They did this so that Noel could get an idea of the home's layout. George also told him to steal the engagement ring and go pawn it for cash. Now, while the police were talking with Noel, they kind of got the vibe that he really admired George and looked up to him. You know, after all, George had helped him a lot, and as we've seen so many times, that power dynamic enabled George to manipulate Noel into doing what he wanted. So even though Noel was loyal enough to commit this crime for George, I think he had the realization that the police knew he had done something terrible, and so he ended up just giving the police all the details. He gave up everything. He even told the investigators where the hammer that was used was buried. He said that he had hit Shauna so hard that the hammer broke in 2 pieces. He also told them, and this is like so heartbreaking, that while he was beating her, she pleaded with him to stop and asked him, "Why are you doing this to me?" And he kept going until she died. So by this point, it became glaringly obvious that George TFA used Noel to murder his wife. Now, for some reason, before detectives arrested George, they decided to call his sister and mother and let them know that he was a suspect in Shauna's death, which seems like absolute ludicrous to do. You know his family's going to call him and tell him, and that gives him the opportunity to flee the country or hurt someone else or hurt himself, Like there's so many options. I just don't understand the logic behind that. I think it was absolutely dumb. Because when George's mother and sister got off the phone with investigators, they immediately called George and told him what was going on. After they ended the call, George immediately jumped in his truck and started speeding recklessly through the streets of Las Vegas and eventually smashed head-on into a concrete barrier. When the police arrived at the crash site, they believed that he was trying to kill himself because there were no skid marks leading up to the accident site. Just like I said, trying to kill himself. Now, fortunately, George, although he was damaged, survived this ordeal. And his saving grace was that he was wearing a seatbelt. See, everyone, seatbelts do save lives. Now, one thing I do want to point out is this is only 9 days after Shauna's murder. So this investigation moved really fast. And on the same day as the accident, on October 8th, George was arrested for the murder of his wife while he lay in the hospital bed while getting treated for his injuries. And as you can probably guess, Noel was also charged with the murder of Shauna TFA. And 3 months later, Noel Stevens pled guilty to murder, conspiracy, burglary, and robbery. Because of this plea, the death sentence was taken off the table and he was sentenced to 42 years to life in prison. But the condition was that Noel would have to testify against his buddy George. And I can imagine that would be one of the hardest things to do, is to testify against someone you really looked up to or cared about. Now, George's trial didn't actually start until August of 2015, and this was 3 years after Shauna had been murdered. And that whole time, he claimed his innocence, and his family stood behind him. During the trial, Noel, as we know, was forced to testify against George, and the prosecution thought he was going to be a star witness. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Despite him telling the court that George had orchestrated this whole murder, bought the weapon, offered him money, and gave him a key to Shauna's home, the defense really owned in on his past criminal history and drug use. The defense really highlighted how unreliable his character was. Not to mention that on the stand, Noel admitted to having hallucinations and hearing voices in his head in the past. And he also admitted to using a lot of drugs. Then Big Will was put on the stand, and he testified under cross-examination and said that everyone knew that you could not always trust what Noel said. So obviously this makes him seem not credible as a witness and poses a huge problem for the prosecution. But fortunately for the prosecution, they had a treasure trove of physical evidence supporting that George and Noel were working together. They had the phone records, and they pointed out that this was not their normal amount of communication. Specifically, they could see from previous records that it was exceeding normal amounts. They had Shauna's DNA on clothing and the hammer found near Noel's tent. They also had the security footage of the two men shopping together for the clothes and the hammer. Now, the defense tried to argue that this was all logical stuff for home maintenance. Now, I'm just going to throw it out there. I don't think a ski mask is logical for home maintenance. Now, after the courts rested and the jury was sent off to deliberate, it took them 3 days to come to a verdict. They found George TFA guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. At the time, George showed no emotion during the verdict or sentencing. A couple of months later, George was also found guilty of conspiracy, burglary, and robbery and was given an additional 32 to 81 years that he would have to serve consecutively. So, in case you don't know what that means, he would have to serve that 32 to 81 years after his life sentence. And even then, he showed no emotion whatsoever. I'm starting to think this man is just like a heartless, emotionless robot at this point. So the one thing I find kind of confusing about this case is the reason behind the murder. What was it? You know, we know that they did have a tumultuous relationship. We know that they were in the process of getting a divorce. But we also know that Shauna is a fairly reasonable woman. She was looking to share custody with George. She made more money than him, so she wasn't trying to take all his money, and he had lost a lot of it anyways. You know, in these circumstances, when there's divorce, there's usually bigger things like money, children, secrets being divulged, stuff like that. But in this case, there's nothing. Was it truly George's little ego being damaged, and that's why he killed her? He couldn't handle getting divorced? I don't really know. Like, reach out, let me know what you think, because I find this one a little confusing. But regardless of why he did it, George was convicted and Shauna's family could somewhat rest. Although this would never bring Shauna back, it was sweet justice. To this day, George and his family stand by his claims of innocence, and I'm sure it's hard for George's family to wrap their minds around this situation. They saw him as a loving family member, but I do have to wonder how they look past the tangible evidence that at least 12 other people, aka the jury, used to find him guilty with. On top of that, my question would be, why did he intentionally crash his car when he found out he was a suspect? I believe that an innocent man would never do that. Never. I would fight to prove my innocence. So is his family a little in denial? Is George in denial? I don't know. And I'm not sitting here judging anyone for supporting their child or sibling, but how can you just ignore the evidence and not see that they're guilty? I'll never get that one. So with that being said, this was the case of Shauna TFA. Thanks for listening. We'll see you soon.
And just your weekly reminder to download our weekly episodes, follow us on Spotify or Apple Music or whatever streaming platform you listen to us on, and give us a follow on our social medias. You can find us at Luminol on the Wall. Can't wait till next week.